I've worn a lot of hats as a writer, journalist, editorialist, essayist, blogger, but of course tonight I'm here with you as author of the recent book, Raising Mixed-Race, Multiracial Asian Children in a Post-Racial World. In this time of Black Lives Matter, escalating racial tensions, violence, a very tense upcoming U.S. election, rife with very troubled rhetoric, and a very fast-growing mixed-race population, it is more important than ever to get real about race and ask big critical questions about the role of mixed race in the pursuit of racial justice and dismantling systemic racism. I want to say that again. We need to ask big critical questions about the role of mixed race in the pursuit of racial justice and dismantling systemic racism. So, despite what you might assume by looking at my book and the image and the title and the subject, and I have talked about this book now for I've done about 4 talks, but it's been out for over 6 months. There's a lot of assumptions made about this book, about sort of it being maybe a multi-culti, we're going to all get along and have fun kind of thing. This actually is a book about racism. It's a book about anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, xenophobia, anti-Muslim hate, white supremacy, settler colonial history, slavery. There are 2 really critical chapters in here about proximity to whiteness and centering blackness. And interestingly, no matter how many times I tell people those chapters are in there, I can just see them be like, wait, what? That's in that book? So this is a book about racism. And it's a book that shows us how we've been indoctrinated to believe many untruths about ourselves and about the lives of others, and how we knowingly and unknowingly transmit those untruths to our children. All these writers here with me tonight have also produced important, gritty works about the same. When I started out asking and forming the questions that would eventually become this book, I suppose I started out innocently enough. I mean, I always knew that I was a mixed person, although when I was a child, there wasn't language to articulate or talk about that in the public, in society, but I still always knew it. I had a consciousness of it. In 2001, I met my partner, who would later become my husband, Dawn, in the back of the room, who's also a mixed identifying person, and so that really elevated my consciousness. We had a lot of conversations about being mixed identifying people, and then in 2009 we had our son, who is also, of course, a mixed identifying person, and so now as a family we had all these questions and conversations, and the questions kept forming and forming, and they led me to research, okay? And I set out into the field. I read books, I looked at articles, I interviewed 68 parents of 75 mixed race children, and I started to notice a really uncomfortable common trend. Here's some quotes from my book. I would say, going back to my son just being, blissfully ignorant about any sort of race, I mean, I don't think he really knows that there are different races of people. I don't think he has any clue that there's this sort of institutionally and culturally made thing called racism. I wouldn't start that conversation unless my son brought it up. It's not like I'm not going to talk about the hard things, but I feel like it's age appropriate to not necessarily make it an issue before it's an issue. In this day and age, it doesn't matter what you are, what you're mixed with, because there's such a mixture of everything, and there's different colors. My son, these are all different parents. My son has no restrictions at this point. He doesn't believe in his race being part of something that holds him down, and he kind of is living in that generation that can believe that. Couples now, it just seems normal to have kids that look different, and they're very accepted and loved, very much so. And I also put here, you can see at the bottom the race of the parents, so that this is like a belief system that's really stretching across racial lines, right? So parents aren't. I want to read this one too. I think my son will be fine if he had a really flat face or hair that stuck up wrong, or like this flip-flop walk. Maybe people would make prejudgments about him, but I feel like he's very capable because he's handsome, physically gifted, very smart. Of the parents I talked to, let me see. The majority of them said, so I'm looking at the bottom 2 bars, okay, that their children showed recognition of race. The top two bars show how often the parents had reflective learning materials in their homes. That means materials where the kids could learn transformative, educational, deep, social justice rooted messages about race. Okay, so you can see the flip. That many kids have recognized, and that many kids have nothing to interact with at home to help them learn more about what they're recognizing. Did you talk about race in a positive way growing up? When I asked parents of their own childhood, you can see the majority said no. When I asked, are you talking about race with your multiracial children now? Still, the majority no or unsure. This is not much improvement. It really needs to be getting better than this, right? And parents aren't alone in these beliefs, are they? This is the kind of stuff we've been seeing in the media for a while. Does anyone know this image? Yeah. 1993, Time magazine came out with this special issue, The New Face of America. This woman is not a real person. She was made by computer, by the meshing of different faces. 2013, National Geographic did something not entirely dissimilar. Did anyone see this article go up? Yeah, the gallery of mixed race people. They called it The Changing Face of America. This is a reflection from Mike, 2014, on the National Geographic Gallery. National Geographic determined what Americans will look like in 2050, and it's beautiful. 2014, different photographer, different mixed race photography project. This was an international project. The photographer captures the future with mixed race family portrait series. 2015, Pew Research just did a huge research project on mixed race populations in America. Their subtitle, Proud, Diverse, and Growing in Numbers. Okay. 2016, mixed marriages are changing the way we think about our race. 2015, why some multiracial people have an advantage in online dating. And then, does anyone remember that Bill Clinton said this one recently? We are all mixed race people. Okay. I have come from a teaching background, so I'm going to ask you questions. I need you to try to answer. What's the message we get from all this stuff? From what these parents are saying to me, what the media is saying to us about mixed race? Just shout it out.
It'll solve racism.
It'll solve racism. What else?
We're in a post-racial society.
Post-racial. We're headed towards, or we are in a post-racial society. Anything else?
It's beautiful.
Beautiful. Better, healthier, stronger, smarter, right? All that stuff. Let me read to you again from my book. There are deep, untested assumptions about how cultural change works, right? Sociologists are how they identify and what they represent. We are not all becoming a polyglot of ethnic ambiguity of the sort used to sell Benetton shirts, she reminds us. The color line is not disappearing, and mixed people do not somehow inherit superhuman powers to undo the meaning of race or bridge communities in strife. And, let's reflect back to those names I gave to you earlier. We all know that's true, right? We are far from solving our racial problems. The encounter of others with mixed race people often turns into mixed race tourism, even voyeurism, and the practice of plastic multiculturalism, says King O'Rain. People see themselves as cosmopolitan and superficially recognizing multiplicity, but at the end of the day, consciously or unconsciously, still buy into white racial framing. What happens then is mixed children and people are actually used as a lever to achieve racially blind political ends, cited as the proof of the success of multiculturalism over racism, while ignoring the proverbial white elephant in the room and ultimately leaving systemic inequities intact. Mixed race does not mean race carefree by any stretch of the imagination, nor does it signal the impending arrival of a post-race. Recognition of race mixing may be increasing, but the white racial frame and systemic racism are still in strong force. The mixed race Asian children in my book, that was 75 kids, had already endured tremendous unsolicited racial scrutiny and racializing targeted by racism, while very few were getting the support needed to understand and skillfully navigate the dominant construct fueling their targeting in the first place. And 100% of parents who were mixed themselves had been discriminated against in ways causing lasting emotional injury. When stark racial inequities remain in full swing, the story of mixedness as the end of race is not only false hope, but avoidant, deceptive, and a sweetly sinister fairy tale. Here's the truth. As you can see by the stark contrast between what parents said and what's real. Okay. Here are the racial identifications of the 68 parents I spoke with, and 25% were mixed race. Also, every single parent of color was able to testify to experiencing discrimination in their life in memorable, lasting ways. Here's some quotes from mixed race parents. It makes me sad that I grew up not loving being multiracial. My name was strange, that I looked different. I remember my mom packed me a sushi bento box in 3rd grade and I threw it away. I wanted peanut butter and jelly like everyone else. Kids would make racial jokes about Chinese people all the time, and I thought they were funny when I was a kid. I didn't realize they were making fun of me. It was, me Chinese, me play joke, me go pee-pee in your Coke. I think I look a lot like my family, but as soon as I had curly hair, particularly with the blackness thing, the tension, like outside my family in particular, oh, you're not Punjabi. And I was like, oh, yes, I am. People will always see my son and my daughter as brown people, which is a very different way that people get treated than if you were Asian clearly in your features, getting associated with being good at math or being a very obedient person, as opposed to, oh, you're a troublemaker because you're African. So as you can see by the stark contrast between what a lot of parents were saying and what's real, we are not doing a good job preparing our mixed children to buffer themselves and stand up for others. And of course, I remember having nightmares that the Ku Klux Klan was going to come and take my sister and I away from my mother. They would come and we would have to choose if we were going to go with our Filipino community or if we were going to go with my white mother. Okay? And of course, alongside the realities of mixed race people, we're segregated now than they were in 1968. Who knew that? American schools are more segregated now than they were in 1968, and the Supreme Court doesn't care. How Pacific Islander students are slipping through the cracks. The poisoning of an American city, which was Michigan. Black Lives Matter, the birth of a new civil rights movement. Native American youth suicide rates are at crisis levels. More than half of Asian American teens are bullied in schools. Anti-Muslim hate crimes are happening with frightening regularity. Immigrant families on the border struggle with criminal tag, and how many knew this? The number of hate groups in the U.S. is rising. Okay? We don't have time, and I know you feel the urgency as much as I do. The time is now. I didn't know when I wrote this book how much would change in the time since it's come out, but so much has changed, and the subject is even more relevant now than when I was writing the book. Okay? Repeat from the beginning. In this time of Black Lives Matter, escalating racial tensions, violence, a very tense upcoming U.S. election, rife with very troubled rhetoric, and a very fast-growing mixed-race population, it is more important than ever to get real about race and ask those critical questions. What is the role of multiraciality in the pursuit of justice and dismantling racism? Because here's the truth. Okay, let's break this down. I think sometimes when we talk about mixed race, we like put it over here, and then all the race stuff is over there, right? But if we're talking about mixed race, we're talking about race. And if we're talking about race, we're talking about racism. We need to pull all of this together. It's time to bust open this ludicrous myth of mixed race being post-racial and somehow apart from other races or the end of racism. And we have to start making a commitment to transformative change and take a stand as parents, teachers, children, whatever our role is. And I'd like to read to you one more passage and then talk to you about the other amazing writers who are here with me tonight. Multiraciality today emerged from centuries of whites pushing anti-blackness and blacks pushing back. The beliefs about race mixing we live with today are not a novel invention of the new millennium at all, but part of a larger white dominant anti-black narrative that has been evolving over many millennia. This means it is not only incumbent upon us to listen and learn about the black experience, but also to recognize in a world that has remained white-dominated across centuries, light to dark still matters on the race continuum, even when we change it to a mixed one. There are deeply rooted white walls in the metaphorical multiracial home, and those walls have texture. Mixed-race Asians are divided from whites and divided from each other in white-directed ways. Asian whites, for example, often receive white favor, including identity options such as symbolic whiteness or ambiguity and the ability to move through the world more fluidly. Non-Black Asian mixes of color grapple with middling status, being of lesser importance to those in power and fighting against displacement. But physically visible Black persons of any known African lineage, despite what they may or may not want to be, are considered Black and treated as such. Claiming any mixed race identity now, including an Asian one, is integrally formed within the context of Black historical opposition to white supremacy, which has always contained a contentious narrative about mixedness. So while appearing light and white and having white family does pose challenges for multiracial Asian children that needs acknowledgement, we must also acknowledge that mixed race cannot escape standing in the shadow of an overarching and long-standing white dominant worldview. In the image of this hierarchical mono-race predecessor, which is controlled by whites still, light white appearing, non-Black multiracial children receive more advantages than their Black and dark appearing counterparts. We must remember that even the multiracial home is rigidly set by a white foundation and framework that places Blackness at the center of racial oppression. No matter what our self-ascribed or assigned identities may be, we absolutely cannot understand race if we do not listen and learn from the racial experiences of Blacks and consider how we are bound to or implicated in those stories. Raising Mixed Race is really one of the very few books out, and I'm not saying this to blow. I always get these expressions wrong, so I'm not even going to go there. I'm not saying this to lift myself up. Raising Mixed Race is one of the very few books out there right now that I think addresses mixedness in a critical race context. Hopefully there will be more. That's why I wrote it, and I'm hoping people will build off of it. I really want you to read Raising Mixed Race. In the meantime, we are so fortunate.
Ordinary things, like to play in the water sometimes. I don't swim, but like the feeling
So I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, which is called Mixed Race Amnesia, Resisting the Romanticization of Multiraciality. So my book really asks a deceptively simple question. What work does the label of mixed race identity do to support a romanticized notion of race? I argue that our romance with multiraciality governs both public perceptions and personal accounts of the mixed race experience, and is facilitated through certain forms of cultural amnesia or strategic forgetting. In the last 10 years in particular, scholars from a variety of disciplinary homes have drawn from and contributed to what is now known as critical mixed race theory. So we have all these conferences, we have all these books, and et cetera, et cetera. But what work is it really doing? I think is an important question to ask. So we see that mixed race people have been either pathologized as having no place to call home, you can all those stereotypes, and poisoned as like torn and confused about the world's racist problems, right? Or celebrated as holding solution to all the world's racist problems. So I want to ask you how it is that we can move beyond these two particular stereotypes and ask how these frames of reference have really limited our fuller understanding of the multiracial experience. And I think, again, Sharon's work and Brandy's work in particular, too, really helps open up a different palette to help us understand this. So I want to look at the particular cartographies of multiraciality. You got to remember, I'm a geographer. That's my training. So I want to think about not just what is race, but where is race? How do we understand that concept a bit more fully? I want to move away from this question, what are you? The objectifying question that we get asked time and time again, and instead investigate this question, where are you from? Which seems to be an intrinsically geographical question, but I want to look at those complex diasporic life histories that inform the process. Moving it from what to where, I think, is an important and now an analytical point that helps us pivot around a different question. So I think something that's really important too, there's a kind of what I call a mixed race narcissism that enters into the conversation. Like, my name is Minelle and I'm mixed race. It's kind of like a mixed race anonymous club. And I think we often write about what intimately touches us. And I chose to talk about mixed race because of the way it's influenced my own life. You know, I think for me, you know, I've always seen myself as mixed, but it wasn't always that way. And again, I think we need to look at the trajectories around how it is we identify in different ways in different places. So I was born in Canada, but my parents are racialized immigrants to Canada. My mother, Faride Afshar, was Iranian, and my father, Kishan Mahtani, was born in India. And so my mother is Muslim and Iranian, and my dad was Hindu and Indian. So I've spent a lot of my life being asked to define myself because I'm perceived as racially ambiguous, right? My race is hard to pin down, apparently. I've joked ironically for years that I've been called every single racial slur in the book, and I'm not kidding about that, but nobody ever seems to get it right. So I've already said that, thinking about mixed race identity, it's nothing new, and I think Sharon's pointed that out beautifully in her talk earlier. The reality is, although, Bill Clinton says we're all mixed in one form or another, certain combination and computations hold different currency value, with mixes of white descent firmly on top. In seeing mixed race as an exciting and progressive racial identity, a strategic forgetting has to take place, a forgetting of our parents' past and of our parents' parents' past. Critical mixed race theory has allowed for a certain kind of forgetting of complex diasporic histories through a focus on a particular kind of temporality. I think it allows for a certain unwriting of history, proffering a form of historical amnesia. So the question is, how do we move beyond this? What is it that we can do to think about understandings of multiraciality in a different time and a different context? Both paradigms, this torn and confused stereotype of multiracial subjects and the best of both worlds, are troubling because of the way they uphold white supremacy. And that's the big issue of multiracial studies, I think, more broadly. Don't get me wrong, I'm complicit in all this. I wrote, I was one of the editors for this book, Global Mixed Race, and I felt very honored to be part of it. But what it does is it looks at what it means to be mixed race in different national contexts. But what we need to think about is how we decenter whiteness in these conversations. And that's something that's been really troubling for me too, because here I am, I'm of a dual minority mix. Where do I fit into those conversations? And what is my contribution towards understanding the complicit role I play in upholding white supremacy in the way that I write about multiraciality? And one of the important ways that we need to think about how we do that is how we focus so much of our work in mixed race studies on the interview. So think about, I interview people for a living. That's what I do as a journalist on the radio station, right? You're only capturing one specific moment at one specific time. Your opinion changes over time. Your experience changes over time. And the reality is, just by capturing that one moment, we're not getting into quantitative studies of multiraciality, and people are only talking about what's affecting them at the individual level at that moment. It does not capture systemic racism necessarily. So what we see is this reproduction of these stories over and over and over again. And I'm telling you, if I have to read another master's thesis that looks at interview analysis as the main subject for their methodology, I'm going to lose it, because it doesn't take us anywhere. It's the same story over and over again. So part of what I want to talk to you today about is, where can we go? What is it that we can do a bit differently? I think what we need to do is move beyond simply digging up all these old stories about what we call new forms of racism, because it's nothing really new about it. So that's one point. Such a response may inadvertently lead us to hijack our old stories in terms of telling redemptive tales of our present and future. Things are so much better now. So I think that's something that we need to do, is look at the way that we're harnessing a racist present and sustaining that racist present through the stories of former racism in the past. And that's something that happens a lot in mixed race studies. The question is not whether individuals who identify as mixed race are willing to challenge the way they have been portrayed as anthropological biocuriosities, kind of like butterflies on a shelf. The question is whether or not we're willing to be more honest about the role that we play in the oppression of other racialized groups, particularly Blacks and Indigenous people, and not resisting some of these stereotypes and refusing to step into paralyzing puddles of guilt. I think we need to be more vigilant in understanding the tactical and the strategic qualities of the popular multiracial discourse, which maintain white supremacy, particularly where it seizes upon the dramatic and the elemental, or extraordinary and ordinary elements of early racialized discourses. And I think if we do that, it will open up the way that we can understand our own role that we're playing in really upholding these complicit discourses if we're going to fight against racism. Great.
So I'm Brandy, and I think in order for me to tell you why I'm here, I have to tell you a little bit about who I am, and I do that best by storytelling. I come from a long line of storytellers on both sides of my family. And so basically my dad, he was Pennsylvania Dutch. We grew up in Amish country. My dad's family have been there since the beginning of Pennsylvania. We're Quakers and Pennsylvania Dutch. And our hometown has 800 people in it. So that's where I grew up. And my dad kind of saw on TV what was going on during the civil rights era. But he was very isolated from it, and so he didn't really even have any idea of what racism was until he went to the Vietnam War. He went to the Vietnam War in 1968 after my great uncle became the first casualty from our hometown in the war. So my dad kind of went to follow in his footsteps in a way. Right away when he got to Vietnam, in South Vietnam, he saw what racism was. Part of his training was, they're not people, you have to kill them. They're not human beings, they're something you shoot. He told me he got LSD as part of his rations to desensitize you from having to kill people. And I should have done a trigger warning with this, I'm sorry, but this is what his intro to Vietnam and to racism was. And then he met my mom and fell in love with her. And he told my mom, you know, I really love you. I'm gonna come back for you when my tour is over. So he finished his tour in Vietnam, said he saw a lot of awful things, but still he loved my mom so much he came back a year later, or not even a year, months later as a civilian working for the US government, so in an office, not in combat. And lo and behold, my mom was shocked because she got a lot of American white men saying, I'm gonna come back for you, and no one ever came back, but he did, and then she's like, God damn it. Now I gotta marry him. So they got married at the U.S. Embassy in 1971, and then they came to Pennsylvania. My dad adopted my half-sister, my older half-sister, and she was about 7 years old at the time. And so this was 1971. And I was born 6 months after the Vietnam War ended. So I grew up right away knowing that there was something different about me. I was teased right away. My sister, when she started school in Pennsylvania, they called her Jack. In school, what people called me was Chink and Nigger Nose. And that's what I got. And my dad, in sort of his like F you attitude, was like, you gotta tell him you're a gook and get it right. So it was just sort of like that, like ownership, like, you know, these people are idiots. They're closed-minded. They haven't seen, you know, the world outside of like this very small area that we live in. And so really early on, it was instilled within me that I was going to be a small kid with a really big mouth, and that's how I was going to survive. And so that's pretty much what I did. And so for the last 20 years, I'm 40 now, I've been working in the mixed race communities. This project, this book that we have on sale here, it's a 15-year long project. My co-editor of the original chapbook series, Jamie Ardenya, he's sitting over there. He's a visual artist here in Seattle and is one of the founders of Song Mahal. And he and I started this chapbook series called Mixed Up. And so we were grad students at UCLA, Asian American Studies Department, and we were asked to do this reading for mixed race Asian Americans in Los Angeles. And Jamie and I, we like to have posterity, so we decided to do this chapbook trilogy, which basically means 3 different titles, and then hand bound copies into this one volume with new work. So, and it really is. I was telling my husband, who's also mixed race, he's Australian and Filipino and grew up in Manila, and I was saying, you know, this book is great. It gives people a sense of themselves because, you know, there is not much out there like it. It's hard to find representations of yourself. But what saddens me is that the words that I say in the intro about racism, about civil rights, we're still saying them today. We're still saying them now. And that's what breaks my heart, you know? So I just wanted to read a couple things, and I mean, I've been feeling very sort of bipolar, isolating in the last month because of all that's going on. And I mean, part of this is that, you know, I live in Canada, so I can kind of watch it happening and knowing what's going on with my friends and family, but being in my bubble. And so that's a sort of survivor's guilt I'm thinking, you know. So I've been working this stuff out on social media. So I was going to read a couple things that I've posted in the last couple weeks. And this was after Alton Sterling and Philander Castile were executed. I'm starting to feel like my dad did every day he woke up. He had PTSD from his time in Vietnam, and every morning he had the same sad, hopeless look in his eye. He would try to ask me how I was doing. He would try to care, and I think he did. But he was always so sad about this world. If he were alive today, I'm not sure he could handle all that is going on. I think of my dad all the time because in addition to being a soldier, he was an activist. He wanted equality for everyone. He got spit on when he came back from Vietnam. People called him baby killer, even with my Vietnamese mother and sister at his side. But he took it because he understood why people felt rage. He felt it too. He took the spit like a bullet. He bathed in it. It was his baptism because he recognized what he stood for in his uniform to a lot of people who were sick of the killing, even if he knew he stood for something else. After my dad was in combat in Vietnam, he worked there as a civilian so he could be with his other family, my mother's family, and help out at orphanages and ask Americans back home for donations. After he came back from Vietnam and went to Harrisburg Area Community College on the GI Bill, he wrote passionate essays about how the refugees were new Americans and it was an American obligation to help them make a new life. His viewpoints were radical back then, especially in his small community, but he stated him. What breaks my heart is that his words are still radical 40 years later, and if anything has changed, it's not in a positive direction. So yeah, I'm feeling my dad this morning, and it hurts a lot. And then on the other side of that, because my feelings change all the time, and it's beginning to get exhausting and yet motivating at the same time. A lot of us are tired. A lot of us are raging. A lot of us are feeling defeated, scared, scarred, and done. I know I'm feeling that way, but we are still breathing. We can fight this. We can make our world better for our children. We can. There are countless people who have been killed and no longer can try for that. So, as tired as we might be, we have to keep trying, keep fighting, keep screaming, because we are still breathing and we must.
Sometimes the weather changes everything.
So I went in to talk to them about mixed race, and their teacher was trying to give them some information, but he himself's not mixed identifying. As I kind of walked in, I was like cringing a little bit at some of the stuff he had up on the board, but he was trying, and to his credit, he brought me in. And so I just shared some from my book. I showed them some things from YouTube, and by the end of that class, it turned into sort of a dialogue where we were just talking with each other, and they were sharing, and like really one after the other, these kids started coming out as mixed. And it was like at least 50% of the room, if not more. And so those statistics about mixed identifying people that growing in the US, that's a real thing. I've never felt it the way I felt it that day. It's like, oh yeah, well my grandmother's Japanese, or oh so-and-so, and I'm this and that and the other thing. And some of them were hiding it. Some of them were identifying as white because that's what they felt like they had to do. So this was the first time they were able to say like, well actually I'm surrounded by a lot of Japanese things and I feel really connected to that, and I've never thought about maybe I could have that as part of my identity. The whole class was in tears by the end of the hour. Entire class. People even who were not mixed identifying. So what that said to me was there are just not enough opportunities for us to even have these conversations, and that our youth are hurting and need a place to like process who they are, and then until we do that, we can't move into some of the systemic social work that we need to do, right? Because we're so stuck and mired in like our own confusion.
We do need to address this intergenerational racism trauma that is going on, whether through war or whether through events here in terms of civil rights, but it doesn't get addressed. It just doesn't. And I mean, that's what I ultimately hope to do more of. But it is exhausting work because there's a lot of stuff buried deep in there that we just do not talk about.
But I want to bring in a kind of more, I want to think about this from the position of epistemology, or how it is that we know what we know, how knowledge is created, how we understand what's considered to be legitimate knowledge in mixed race studies. So this idea of intergenerational trauma for multiracial people, actually, and you tell me if I'm wrong, you guys, but it seems there's a very limited field of analysis there. There hasn't been that much written in that particular area because the focus in mixed race studies has mostly been interviewing children about their experiences or women about their experiences, and women who are slightly older. These are people like Frances Wyndon's Twine, did a study of college students, or mostly children, I would say. I would generally say that's within the kind of focus of the methodology. So you've got to ask yourself about the limitations of that kind of analysis, right? If we're only talking to children, we're not getting a much broader picture of the kind of quantitative and the longitudinal analysis that I think that's really key. And then you also have to ask yourself, who have been the leaders of the multiracial movement, particularly pushing forward questions around the census? It's mostly been white mothers of Black or mixed race children. And I think that's had a huge emphasis or shift on the way in which we've seen the research emerge. So I think it's high time that multiracial scholars got together and said, what is it that we're really trying to do? What is our true commitment to social justice, right? What is the value of those stories? So I think that there really needs to be a shift in that direction. It's interesting that none of us want to tackle this question. No, I think it's really interesting, right? And part of the reason why I think, I don't want to speak on behalf of my very esteemed colleagues here, but why it is that I'm more timid to explore that is you're talking about a really important mission that exists in critical mixed race studies. And it goes back to the very intense heteronormativity of multiracial studies. And that's the key part of it, right? I mean, when I first discovered multiracial studies, I was like, oh, of course, relationships between queer theory and mixed race studies. It seemed so obvious to me to go there. And I don't know about you guys, but thinking about the advent of identity politics in the 1990s and thinking about the potential and the possibilities, it's never, at least you guys tell me if I'm wrong, I don't really feel like it's ever truly emerged. So I think for you to think about queerness and masculinities, we have a long way to go. And I think that's because of who's producing this research and again, to what end. Okay.
I don't want to go too much into it because I think so much more work needs to be done, but it does occur to me that as these shootings after shootings after shootings happen, that we see a lot of articles about a lot of pieces, and we very seldom see articles about male violence. That seems to be sort of like the piece that kind of gets left out, like, oh, well, all the shooters are white. They're not all white. Well, all the shooters are this, all the shooters are that, but we don't talk a lot about all the shooters are men. All of them are cis men. And what does that mean about the way that cis men are socialized in our society? They consider violence as a, whether, Asian, Black, white, as a solution to strife, right? So.
I would agree with both Minelle and Sharon. And to further that, I'm sure you've thought about how a lot of the language in terms of talking about queerness and mixed race are very similar in terms of passing and the hierarchy of how you can pass and what you identify as and what you come out as, like, coming out as Asian or coming out as Black or coming out as white. And so there are a lot of parallels to that. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the civil rights era for still. I feel like history keeps repeating itself, but I guess that's just how it rolls, And we have a lot to learn and move forward with marriage equality in this country. So. Supposed to be a non-Black person of color, and I've been trying to get my older kids especially to understand this because I do feel we are very insulated from that in Vancouver, which likes to pride itself as a multicultural city. So I've been talking to my kids a lot about this, and when we went to the vigil, my 5-year-old, she was getting kind of cranky, it was hot, she was hungry. And she said, "Mommy, why are we here?" Amidst all the singing and the chanting going on. And it was a very peaceful, very inspirational, very sad. There were a lot of emotions going on for all of us. And I had to try to articulate that to her. Why are we here? Like, why are we here? And to a 5-year-old, and I think this is where Sharon's book probably is like really helpful for one of these scenarios. And I simply told her, I will explain to you later, but we're here because we are trying to be with our friends, and we're trying to help our friends who need our help right now. And that's the simplest way I could put it to a 5-year-old. To my older kids, I'm like, you realize, look, yes, your ancestors have experienced discrimination. It is not like the kind of discrimination that's going to get you shot and killed right now. And you have to recognize that. That's what that means for your body. You know, when you travel to the US, you do not have to worry about that. And that's fucked up. And I tell them straight up, that's fucked up. And that's what we need to change. And so going to these things and speaking to our children, and I remember you said, you know, children, they can take it, you know, and this whole thing about, is it age appropriate to talk to your kids? Because this is the world that they're inheriting. This is the world we're giving to them. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. I just kind of went off.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to speak to your question and then tell me if I'm not maybe later. But identifying as mixed race was this journey that I went on as I wrote this book, from saying I'm mixed race, she's mixed race, he's mixed race, they're mixed race, to I'm a mixed race identifying person. Are you a mixed race identifying person? And the reason that I learned the history that was never given to me in schools, that there have always been so-called quote-unquote mixed people, and particularly for the black community. That's a very, very painful subject, because being mixed race was not something that was allowed for the black community here. I mean, temporarily on the census there was one attempt to like quantify mixed black peoples, and then it was like, forget it, we're just going to call them all slaves. So, you know, very painful subject, and there are plenty of mixed people. And then also for like Native and Indigenous communities, being mixed is not necessarily significant for Indigenous people. It's like, I'm Indigenous, like the fact that I'm mixed, you know, whatever, but like I claim my indigeneity. So I came to understand that a mixed, and so I also do question these statistics about like growing mixed race populations. I think it's more about who's choosing to identify, and always indicating in our language that not everybody has that choice and doesn't want to make that choice. And what the relationship is to different communities and their particular histories. Does that kind of speak to what you're talking about? Yeah, like, you know, remember Black history, remember like history of Native peoples, and that's not going to be the same experience or narrative as someone like me who's biracial, Asian, white, right?
So here's where I'm at now with all this stuff, is the label of mixed race does nothing in and of itself. I really don't think it does much anymore. What I want us to think about is how the label of mixed race is not only just anti-Black at times, but also anti-Indigenous. And I think that's a really important part that we need to look at. And the reason why I've come to that is, you know, I'm a journalism professor, so I started looking at representations of multiraciality in the Canadian context. And I noticed that there's a new label for mixed race people in Canada called the New Métis. And you can think about how troubling that is if we understand Métis identity in Canada to be both like French and Indigenous. And here, this label, New Métis, was being used to describe people like me of racialized minority backgrounds. So we're hijacking this term that belongs to Indigenous families and thinking that they're old and we're new, relegating them to the dustbins of history, and we're somehow this newfangled population. So that's where I think we need to be thinking about our own complicity in the use of these terms and why they matter. Let me
It's not maybe always about what we say, but our intention and the way we act and the choices we make. And then also for me, stepping down and saying, I don't need to take up all this space. I would like to give some of my space to you if you'd like to come and use it. I think people should hear your words. So I didn't actually say anything really. I just said, do you want some of this space? And that meant a lot to some of the people who came to join me.
Well, like I said at the beginning, I'm a storyteller, so I talk to people and I tell stories. And I think that's in sort of like getting people to understand or decentering whiteness, you have to put the focus on it a bit. So what I do is I tell people, I'm in this sort of odd position as the daughter of a Vietnam War vet and a Vietnamese woman. This is what, I'm not just saying race, but sort of class, education, being a vet as opposed to being a Vietnamese woman means. This is the imbalance. So, you know, as a Vietnamese woman, my mother basically got told, in a nutshell, we're letting you in our country because we destroyed yours, but don't expect any special treatment. So we have a whole population of Vietnamese Americans who have the same PTSD that the vets do, but they don't get treated for it. They don't even, well, it would be hard, number one, just imagine trying to find some culturally sensitive therapists who can understand what these experiences are for this population in their culture. But so there's not even an attempt to address that or even know what happens there. As opposed to my white American father, who he has PTSD. He passed away 2 years ago from lung cancer due to Agent Orange exposure. It took him 20 years. Like they can say, look at your body, you're fine. You know, we'll still give you the benefits because you fought for our country, but you have to prove to us that you've had trauma. And so he spent 20 years going to the records in Maryland to dig up these records to show that he was at this particular location in Vietnam where he watched a mother and a son's body rot for a month while he was sitting in a foxhole. And he had to do this over and over again until they said, okay, yeah, you've got PTSD for 20 years. But he still got to do that. And the tension that caused in my family between my mother and my father, because my mom's been told, you know what, you lived through this, so what, you're an American now, get over it. And my mom's telling my dad, you know what, I was told to get over it, you need to get over it. And that is a story I tell often because it just shows you the disparity between very similar experiences and how privilege plays out in these different ways. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on that I think it is also sometimes saying it, like I'm admitting my poor white skin privilege. I just said it. I said it. Okay, that's like a real thing. I'm not going to not say it, and I think that really matters. Is being transparent about knowing your privileges. That can be a way to decenter whiteness. But then you say that, and then you need to move aside, right? Because you need to make space. So.
Just quickly, because I know we got to get out of here. So I've been teaching this course called Spaces of Multiraciality, Critical Mixed Race Theory at U of T since I started. So that's 10 years ago. And when I first started the course, it was like, oh, let's trot out the Bill of Rights by Maria P.P. Root and talk about how I have the right to identify whatever way I want. And it was very kind of like a liberation class for students. So all the mixed race students would come into the class and they'd recognize they were mixed race, and at the end of it, they'd feel so good about themselves because they had a place in which they could talk about their identity. So I have totally shifted from thinking about that because that does not decenter whiteness. It is not an effective strategy at all. So I think the focus in a lot of pedagogy and multiracial studies has been thinking about love. And how is it that people cross over barriers in order to find love? I want to focus on another L, 3 other L's actually. Law, land, and labor. If we don't think about law, land, and labor in our analysis of multiracial studies, it's simply not going to be progressive, and it's simply not going to help us decenter multiracial studies in any way that helps us understand white supremacy.